And I'd like to begin by introducing the first paper for first presentation in the second panel, and that's going to be Riley Gervin, who's presenting based on the paper entitled Small Victories, Identity, Autonomy, and Female Memory of Soviet Gulags. So thanks, Riley, if you want to come on up.
Thank you. And I'm going to go ahead and jump right in with a quote for maximum dramatic effect. What's the point of faith to some fatherland? Why pretend that we've one settled home? Now, facing life's judgment, each one of us is merciless, indigent, strong. Anna Barkova was one of the many women incarcerated in the Soviet Gulag system who recorded her experiences in a memoir. This excerpt is from an untitled poem written in her memoir during her 20 years in a Soviet prison. It reflects not only disillusionment with state power, but I think more importantly, the resilience and strength of women under demoralizing prison conditions. So my project looked at memoirs and oral histories of women who experienced the Soviet gulags, Soviet prison camps, and more specifically, the ways that these women used their bodies to assert a limited sense of control over their unfortunate situations. And so a little bit of background on gulags for those who don't know. Gulag began as an acronym for the Main Administration of Corrective Labor Camps and Colonies. And this was an acronym in Russian, obviously, but it's used now in academia as more of a broad term to describe the entire system of Soviet prison camps. So one camp, a labor camp, would be a gulag, and the whole system itself is considered the gulag system. And this is the way that I use the term in my paper to examine the memoirs that I looked at. And in general, the Gulag system existed between roughly 1918 and the mid-1960s, so from Lenin to Brezhnev, and ranged all the way from the Eastern European portions of the Soviet Union, Central Asia and the Kazakh steppe, and Siberia. So these are thousands of Soviet prison camps, excuse me, with millions of incarcerated people. And looking at these women and their memoirs was a really important way to examine the life of prisoners. And memoirs in particular are important because of the way that memory is constructed by people who undergo these kinds of experiences. And so although there are challenges with looking at memoirs, such as the idea that many of these memoirs were written much later than the events that they give, it's also important to look at them as a strength because these women constructed narratives around the way that they viewed themselves within the Gulag system. So that's my draw as far as looking at these memoirs, especially of the women. And as far as historiography goes, just a brief note on the way that my paper kind of looked at the Gulags in general is that Gulag literature kind of followed Alexander Solzhenitsyn's view of the Gulags in most of the latter half of the 20th century, which is that Gulags were sort of a Gulag archipelago, these isolated spaces of punishment, punitive spaces, and that they were a separate space from Soviet society. And many people still argue that this is the way that we should interpret the Gulag system, but my paper also incorporates looking at the Gulags as this new spaces of reflecting the larger Soviet system. So Dr. Michael David Fox looks at it in this way, and he recently published a new anthology on Gulag literature that interprets the Gulags as a larger reflection of Soviet society. So the concentrated reflection of the bureaucracy as a whole, the goal of which was dehumanization and control, which is a very important part of life for women who lived in the Soviet gulags, and their memoirs reflect this. And it's important in this context because memoirs from women who experienced Soviet prison camps emphasize how recollection can become an act of self-definition through the distinctly female perspective. So as far as my main findings go, I came in to this research very in awe of these memoirs and excited to look at them. And I think when you come in to reading memoirs of places like gulags, you come in with a certain kind of mindset that there's going to be a lot of deprivation and rape and solitude and starvation, and all of that is extremely prevalent and important to consider in these memoirs. And I think the surprising thing for me, and the main finding of my research, however, was that most unexpectedly, examination of female Gulag memoirs reveals the ways that women identified spaces of limited power and autonomy by means of sex, pregnancy, work, and the small victories of everyday existence and subversion in the gulags. And these memoirs not only preserve how female prisoners viewed the system they were incarcerated in, but also their own roles and identities within this system. So as far as my three main categories that I looked at, sex, pregnancy, and work, I looked at these particular categories because of the fact that they all involve the female body and control over the female body, and the idea of control of the Soviet state over female bodies. And these categories were very important and prevalent in all the memoirs that I read. And so when deciding what sources to use, these memoirs spoke very prevalently of all of these topics. And one particular and strong example of pregnancy being used as a way to determine autonomy in the Soviet prisons comes from Hava Volovich. She was a Russian actress, and she was imprisoned in 1937 for anti-Soviet agitation. She gave birth to a child while incarcerated in 1947. Although she recognized the terrible conditions into which her child would be born, she wrote in her memoir, "Our need for love, tenderness, and caresses was so desperate that it reached the point of insanity, of beating one's head against a wall, of suicide, and we wanted a child, the dearest and closest of all people, someone for whom we could give up our own life. I held out for a relatively long time, but I did so need and long for a hand of my own to hold, something I could lean on in those long years of solitude, oppression, and humiliation to which we were all condemned." So she felt this degradation, this dehumanization that was the goal of these punitive spaces in the Soviet Union, and she sought to subvert this control over her body by creating a separate world within the prison environment that she could inhabit with her child. And this is one of the strong examples of this. But it's also interesting to note that I looked at in my paper that other women chose to become pregnant for different reasons. Some women chose to become pregnant because they received better treatment. They could survive because they received larger food rations for being pregnant. They received better treatment when they were pregnant. And this is also an example of them asserting autonomy through their own bodies. And another example is that women chose not to be pregnant as a form of control. And one woman watched a mother and her child, her newborn baby, die of starvation in front of her. And in her memoir, she wrote that she vowed she would never be a mother under socialism. And that was her way, her small victory, her small identity of herself was to associate the control of the state with the death of this mother and child that she watched die, and she vowed that she would never be a mother because of that. So even though these women chose different things, one woman chose to be a mother because she found that as her separate space to inhabit within the prison environment, and one woman chose to never have children as a result of having this own space within the prison environment. Both women, I think, used this as a means to assert a sense of control and autonomy in a space in the most limited way that they could, because obviously these were very punitive spaces. As far as work goes, it was very similar. When women saw work as their patriotic, the Soviet state interpreted work as a patriotic duty and a way to cleanse prisoners, and conversely, women interpret this very differently in their memoirs. So one woman wrote, "Labor was the only human activity left to us. We didn't have families, there were no books. We lived in filth, stench, and darkness. Labor was human and clean." And I think this is very indicative of the way that women took something that was supposed to be a control of the state, labor. They were supposed to work and become clean and cleanse themselves. But they took this in their memoirs and reinterpret it into a context that meant they could have limited control and interpretation of the way they viewed themselves in the prison system. And I think that's really important and is often overlooked. So in conclusion, the memoirs from women in Soviet gulags demonstrate their means of limited autonomy and control of their bodies by means of sex, pregnancy, and work. Memoirists wrote and published at different times across numerous spaces throughout the Soviet Union. But for survivors, creation of memory through personal recollection worked as a unifying practice of self-definition. This act in and of itself can sometimes, and some people argue, can be interpreted as in opposition to the goal of control and dehumanization within the gulags. And this is still very, very important for everyone today, because, especially in Russia, because Putin and his administration are actively trying to obliterate memory of the Soviet gulags. The Human Rights Campaign Memorial is a Russian human rights campaign, and actually a lot of my sources for my paper came from Memorial's archives. And over the last 7 to 10 years, Putin and his administration have been trying to shut down Memorial and have actually wiped some of their archives and at times have succeeded in shutting them down. So I think it's very important that people remember these women who suffered and who also triumphed and had their small victories. So we cannot forget these women that fought and existed and tried to define themselves within dehumanizing spaces. So I'd like to thank Maya Peterson for helping me edit this paper and throughout the process of writing, and all my peers who helped edit. I know Ian helped me a lot editing this paper, so thank you to everyone who helped. Thank you.
Thanks, Riley. So the next paper we have is from Al-Harith Abu-Amara. The title of the paper is Shanghailander, the Formation and Expression of Identity Among Shanghai's British Settlers. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. My name is Harith Abu-Amara. By this point, you would have heard many excellent presentations. Hopefully, you will enjoy mine as well. The topic that I chose to focus on was on the Shanghailander, who were a British community that lived in the international settlement during the 19th and 20th century. And this was for Gail Hirschatter's historical narration and memory in China course. So in some ways, the Shanghailander communities were similar to those that existed across the British Empire. What made this community special was where it took shape, because while many of their contemporaries had to settle in wide, expansive spaces of places like Australia and Canada, the Shanghailanders had to forge their own identity within a well-established city and one of the longest continuous civilizations in the world. It was in this environment that Shanghailanders had to forge a unique identity for themselves. How their identity emerged and how it influenced their interactions with the people around them is the focus of my paper. I aim to address these questions within the time frame of the 19th and 20th century in order to properly trace the development of the Shanghailander identity and provide insight into what the community was like before the 1920s. For this research, I asked myself 3 questions. From the 1840s up to the end of World War I, what did the Shanghailander identity consist of? What major events caused the identity to present itself for the first time? And how did this identity influence their interactions with the major groups within the international settlement, such as the Chinese and Japanese, and why? In brief, this is what I found. 1, the Shanghailanders viewed themselves as a fiercely independent people, made up of people who were cosmopolitan in their outlook and environment and practiced a unique form of British culture. 2, the Shanghai Jubilee of 1893 was when these elements united into a single identity in public for the first time. And finally, the Shanghailander identity came into constant conflict with the Chinese and Japanese, who constantly outnumbered them. The Shanghailanders would view them as either inferior or as a people with incompatible cultures. The development of the independent aspect came from how, unlike the situation in the nearby crown colonies of Hong Kong and India, the British within the settlement had to form their own government and control their own militias. The government was originally formed in 1845 as a renter society that sought to both establish order and engage in infrastructural projects. When the Taiping Rebellion broke out in the 1850s, devastating much of China's heartland and threatening Shanghai, the society reorganized itself into the Shanghai Municipal Council and immediately took control over the militias already formed by the British settlers, most notably the Shanghai Volunteer Corps. The Corps fought against both the Small Sword Society, which was an organization that affiliated itself with the Taiping, and against the Qing soldiers, fearing that they would bring the fight to the settlement. Their victories against both contingents and the British Empire's reluctance to intervene became a point of pride for the Shanghailanders, who they felt were able to successfully organize the defense of their homes when the British Empire proper failed to do so. The cosmopolitan aspect came from how the British elites within the settlement often interacted with both Western businessmen and the Chinese guilds. They specifically worked with the businessmen to help establish or bring over conglomerates to the settlement, such as the Asiatic Petroleum Company, which was a joint venture between the British and the Dutch, and with the guilds to act as mediators between the settlers and the Chinese whenever tensions between them reached a fever pitch. The elites would frame these interactions as the British settlers bringing a model civilization to China by benevolently placing both the miscellaneous Europeans and the Chinese under their tutelage and getting them to interact peacefully with each other. This was frequently done through newspapers they controlled, such as the English language and widely circulated North China Herald. The British culture aspect was one of the last to emerge. Unlike most of their contemporaries, the Shanghailanders held the government in Westminster in contempt. They felt the British government was misguided in their Chinese policies and were trying to encroach on their independence. And the Shanghailanders wrote editorials in the settlement newspapers condemning inflammatory comments by the colonial officials about their militias and Westminster's surprise in the Boxer Rebellion. For the latter, they insulted the British leadership with terms like armchair philanthropists. Despite this, they still publicly celebrated events like Queen Victoria's Jubilee, subscribed to popular publications from London, and ran the works of the Empire's celebrated writers like Rudyard Kipling in their newspapers. They saw themselves as heirs to the British culture, even if they were not as patriotic about the colonial bureaucracy. The Shanghai Jubilee of 1893 was when these three elements pushed themselves into the forefront of the Shanghailander community, by making them the major themes of the festivities. For example, we can see their sense of independence in the way that they celebrated the victories of the Shanghai Volunteer Corps, making them centerpieces of the military parades. We can also see the cosmopolitan in the unveiling of the official coat of arms that consisted of the flags of every nation that had a consulate in Shanghai, all tied together with a slogan that, translated from Latin, reads, "All together as one." And we could see their Britishness in the very concept of having a jubilee, which was a common form of celebration within the Empire's colonies, and the constant speeches that exalted the benefits of bringing in English society to China. The Jubilee was acclaimed within the local press as celebrating the achievements of both the international settlement and the Shanghailander community. The term Shanghailander, not so coincidentally, was used a lot more frequently in both the press and in colloquial vernacular afterwards. There was a dark side to the identity, however. The identity would come into conflict with the Chinese, whom the Shanghailanders felt were inferior and felt constantly outnumbered by. These conflicts manifested in de jure discrimination. A notable example was when, starting in the 1880s, the Chinese faced restrictions on visits to the settlement's popular park. Originally required to obtain a special permit, they were eventually banned outright from using it, starting in 1913. This became known as the infamous "No Dogs or Chinese" ban, even though it was never officially regarded as such. Other examples appeared even in the Shanghai Jubilee, when the Chinese were segregated from Western audiences during the parades, and newspapers like the Shanghai Mercury intentionally avoided photographing the Chinese when they ever took photographs of the crowds. Incidents like these eroded the cosmopolitan aspect of their identity and made the identity more racialized, becoming more associated with the Anglo-Saxon race. The Japanese, too, would run into conflict with the Shanghailander identity. These conflicts only started appearing after 1895, when the Japanese in Shanghai started to outnumber the Shanghailanders within the settlement, eventually becoming the largest foreign group there by 1950. Rather than viewed as inferior, the Japanese were seen as incompatible with Shanghailander values. especially since the Japanese viewed their own microcosm as being part of the Japanese Empire, to the point where they refer to it as an extension of the Nagasaki Prefecture. These attacks happened in the press, where the Shanghailanders ran articles claiming the Japanese immigrants were insulting the Shanghailanders' race and culture in their local newspapers, as well as claiming that they were conspiring to undermine Western trade in China. The attacks also extended to Shanghailanders gerrymandering the council to limit Japanese influence. By 1918, there were only 2 Japanese serving on the council, compared to the 5 Shanghailanders and 2 Americans. And in my conclusion, from the 1840s up to 1918, the British community in Shanghai saw the development of the Shanghailander identity, consisting of 3 parts: feelings of independence, cosmopolitanism, and the feelings of Britishness. It reached its peak during the Shanghai Jubilee of 1893, in which these elements were proudly displayed in open celebration. The dark side of the Shanghailander identity is that it led to conflicts with the Chinese and Japanese residents of the settlements, whom they felt were either inferior or these cultures were contradictory to their values, respectively. The result in the Shanghailanders trying to restrict Chinese and Japanese from social or political activities, and for the Shanghailander identity to take on a more racial tone when dealing with them. You might be wondering why all this is significant. Given how the issue of identity is starting to become more and more prevalent in today's climate, I believe it is important to discuss how it can be forged by events or social climates, and then show how it can be twisted into something sinister or contradictory when confronting with people who are perceived as inferior or hiding ulterior motives. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Harith. So our final presentation comes from Kade Muffett, and this is based on the paper entitled Eyes on the Uyghur, Media Representations of a Chinese Minority.
All right. Now you get to hear about movies. Exciting. All right. So my presentation is Eyes on the Uyghur, and I'm going to be talking about a very specific Chinese minority. Right direction. Excellent. So this is the layout of my paper. I'm not going to spend any time on this. So first, a brief intro. Xinjiang is this enormous area in China's northwest. It's very distinct from the coastal regions that we usually associate with China. This is definitely not Shanghai. And so here's a picture of what Xinjiang looks like on the ground. Much of it is uninhabitable. And that which can support life is very far from Beijing. Xinjiang is home to many minority populations, but the largest of these is the Uyghur, making up slightly less than half of Xinjiang's 24 million residents. Uyghurs are a Turkic Muslim minority who have a very distinctive physical appearance and cultural traditions. Uyghurs face serious discrimination legally, professionally, and socially in China. In a situation like this, representation makes all the difference between the image of loyal citizens and terrorists. Han Chinese are receiving distinct messages from their media. Uyghurs are distinctly other, either fearsome or exotic, depending on their sex. Today we're going to look at them through the lens of Chinese media, and we begin with the 1963 film Visitor on Ice Mountain. So this is a movie about a Uyghur Russian spy who's replaced a young Uyghur woman named Gundalam to trick Gundalam's childhood sweetheart into letting the Russians invade Xinjiang. The plot's not actually what we're going to talk about. It's kind of bad. Instead, we're going to focus on this woman we have over on the right. Her name, that's Gundalam, or fake Gundalam. And so she is important because she is heavily fetishized throughout the movie. She's, like, in the movie, she's retiring, shy, soft-spoken, and modest. And while this movie is ostensibly about spies, very little of it is spent on developing that plot. Instead, we spend a lot of time ogling the strange ways of this minority woman and her village. So her male counterpart, you saw him before, he's kind of a blank slate, like he's just a normal dude. He's Uyghur, but he doesn't really show any of the signs of being Uyghur in terms of like his cultural depiction. In other movies from the same time period, we don't see this shy, retiring female lead. Instead, we see vibrant, peppy young women who work hard, sing happy songs, and become members of the CCP. In Red Flower of Tianshan, we see a female protagonist who follows this pattern, becoming a local official because of her red spirit. She's very, very pro-communist. She's very happy. The difference between her and Gundalum is that Gundalum is a Muslim Uyghur. The cultural restrictions associated with her are fetishized in Visitor on Ice Mountain in a way that the ones in Red Flower of Tianshan are not. So there's a pretty substantial gap between this and the next movie that we're talking about because of the Cultural Revolution in China. So when we start seeing Uyghurs on screen again, we're well into the economic reform era. And China's economic reforms did not improve the situation of Uyghurs like they did for Han. The Han population of Xinjiang is not only profiting from reform, but growing in size at this time. And so now we end up with a tale of two Xinjiangs, one Han and one Uyghur. The Han one is booming from oil exports and trade with Central Asia, and the Uyghur one has been held back from benefiting from the reforms. This is Urumqi, which is the capital city of Xinjiang. It was not very developed. As you can see, all of these buildings are very new, and it's a very segregated city, and most of the rich areas are pretty much exclusively Han. So here we have the movie, the 1987 movie Buying and Selling, which is a Uyghur love story. And the tropes from the 60s come rushing back to meet us with a new edition. Here again we see the lead, Dilinar, exoticized and fetishized. Our intro to her is through a 5-minute dance in which she's in a very tight red dress, dancing a sensual version of a traditional Uyghur dance, and regularly looking right into the camera, like the goal is to market her to the audience as opposed to actually to her male co-star. So the new addition is this. The leading man works at a kebab stand where the blank slate male was in the 1970s. He's now been replaced by a street peddler. Alternate images are loiterer, a ne'er-do-well, and then in the 1990s, we take it one step further, and the Uyghur male becomes a terrorist in Chinese imagery. So because of increased economic stress, religious suppression, and ethnic discrimination, these Uyghur communities become increasingly angry with the Chinese government, and after a couple of high-profile protests in the 1990s, the Chinese government cracks down hard. Despite relative freedom of religion for minorities in the past and no documented instances of extremist Islamic violence, by 2001, China insists to the U.S. that it, too, has a problem with radical Muslim terrorists living within its borders. All violence committed by Uyghurs has now become characterized as religious extremist violence. As global consciousness of Islamic terror groups rose in the 2000s, so it did in China, meaning more media devoted to terror than before. This is the percentage of stories in Chinese news sources that are terrorism-related about Muslims. And these spikes are over, the first one is over the Urumqi riots in 2009, and the second one is over the Tiananmen Square attack in 2013. The 2009 Urumqi riots were essentially a set of race riots in Urumqi with enormous casualties, and they were caused by anger over the beating of a Uyghur in the larger Chinese diaspora, not within Xinjiang. The Tiananmen Square attack took the form of a man crashing his car into Tiananmen. It then exploded. Etim, which is the Eastern Turkestan Islamic movement, later took credit for this, but it's not sure whether he meant for them to take credit for it or not. All the people in China see news about Muslim terrorists, about how Uyghurs are useless, how they benefit from pro-minority CCP programs, and yet people think they're out on the streets being thugs. It's a very unified narrative, but then there's something else to the story. All of these negative characteristics described average Uyghurs, and then there's a whole other tier of celebrity Uyghurs. As you can see, Uyghurs have a mix of traditionally European and traditionally Asian features, and this has made them very popular models for expensive product lines in China, as well as popular actresses and actors. Han find them different enough to be exotic, but they still speak perfect Chinese, which makes them easy to work with for companies. All of their features are very in right now, like the double eyelid. And the best example of this is Dilraba Dilmurat, one of the most popular actresses in China. She plays into an old tradition. None of Dilmurat's characters are explicitly Uyghur, and certainly none are Muslim. But these girls, generally 17 to 19, are wild and carefree, often pugnacious, and have to be tamed by men. She's an example of the fetishization of her ethnicity and the wildness of minority women trope. She's famous but does not manage to escape the depictions of minority women that have accompanied Chinese women since the film industry started. So Negmat Rahman is another famous Uyghur. He's a daytime TV show host. He's a little bit Steve Harvey. He has 8 shows all at the same time. While he's not portrayed as a thug, he avoids everything that has become taboo for Uyghurs, and that's the only reason he's managed to escape the thug image. He never speaks of religion. He always looks very cheeky, never serious, and he gives the impression of a short and non-threatening man. He shows that in order for Uyghurs to be seen, they must not speak on being Uyghur and will be viewed as diversity hires. He was actually the host of the 2015 New Year's Gala, CCTV New Year's Gala, which is a very important event as a token minority. And it was just a day after 17 Uyghurs were killed in Xinjiang by CCP forces, but in the broadcast he called China peaceful and harmonious. So all of these media images and stories negatively impact the quality of life for Uyghurs both in Xinjiang and in China more generally by creating a very distinct and often ugly narrative for their culture and individual lives. While individual Uyghurs can become successful, this is generally only by generally by conforming to Han aesthetics, behavioral patterns, and desires. Negative media portrayal of Uyghurs has increased since the early 2000s and impacts Han views of the Uyghurs. Depictions of Uyghur women as exotic dancers and of Uyghur men as pickpockets or terrorists destroy job opportunities, lessen educational attainment, and create a society that enables the deterioration of Uyghur rights in Xinjiang, and the dominant population's willingness to call such depictions justified. Thank you.
Thank you, all three, so much for those terrific presentations. And it's really striking. I know that we've got some people from my History 100 class here, which is great. And so this is a great opportunity to think about the kind of the end point for a lot of the research skills you're developing right now. And I was just going to comment. I was so striking to get a sense of the diversity of the kinds of sources all three of you employed in developing your papers, but the careful reading that entailed in kind of not just taking them on their own terms, but trying to figure out how you can kind of get into them and put them in context in order to ask some really different and difficult questions about identity and intention. So I really congratulate you on those three terrific papers. So we have time for some questions. So I'm going to take this microphone to the presenters, and Stephanie has the microphone this is to capture for the recording, not to amplify your voice, so if you came in and didn't see this last time. So she'll come around to take your questions. So questions for our presenters, Riley?
So I have a question for Kade. You brought up a lot of Chinese language media about Uyghurs. Is there any, or is there like a substantial amount of media of whatever form made by Uyghurs in the Uyghur language meant to serve the broader Uyghur community?
So there is, but most of it has a significant political tilt, and most of the academic research on Uyghurs is in either Chinese or English. Stuff in Uyghur is often related to political independence movements, or is local broadcast put on by the Chinese government in Uyghur languages. It's certainly a dying language, unfortunately.
My question's for Riley. Thank you for the fascinating paper. And I thought the woman you described who had a child, in part seeking that sort of intimate human companionship that we all need in this, in these horrific conditions. But it raised questions for me of childhood and motherhood in the context of a gulag. Because, of course, one possible outcome, it would seem to me, is a horrifying separation of mother and child at a young age. Were children ever, how long were they able to stay with their mothers in these circumstances? Did you find examples of them being taken and placed in other families or orphanages, that kind of thing? I'm just curious what motherhood and childhood looks like.
It looked very different depending on the type of gulag, because the prison camps were divided based on things like types of labor, the kinds of crimes committed. So like political crimes were obviously camps that were a little bit more, they had better conditions and would have better child, some of like the ones for political prisoners, there's an example I think of a child nursery, where the women would work during the day, they would have their labor quota to fill, and then the child would be cared for at usually a daycare center where they employed other women who were in the gulag to care for the children. But most of the memoirs where women did have children with them in the gulag had a lot of complaints about the way that children were treated. They were malnourished, often left to their own devices for most of the day, and just a lot of horrific stories about starvation. And but oftentimes, if the child was not kept in these sort of prison nurseries or with the mother, then they would be sent to Soviet orphanages. So that did happen.
I was just curious. Oh, okay. I'm over here. Okay. Hello. I was just curious. How do you avoid burnout when you're doing your research? I think after a while, as history majors, it's a lot of reading and writing. It's a lot of dedication to the work that we're given. So how do you avoid the burnout in a lot of ways, and avoid quitting and avoid not reading 200 pages you have to read? So how do you avoid it?
So, I mean, I guess for my project was long term. I started it in the spring or the winter quarter of 2017, and it started out as just kind of an 8-page research paper, and it turned out that it was something I wanted to develop further. So, and then I took Meyer Peterson's Soviet Experience seminar in the spring quarter. So I had 20 weeks-ish. So I had more time than people normally get for these kinds of papers. But I think planning ahead and knowing kind of what you want to research is important. And then also I had a lot of memoirs to read specifically for my paper. So I would take probably one memoir a week, 1 or 2 memoirs a week, and I would divide it up that way. But it is difficult when you have a lot of the same sources and a lot of the same secondary sources that you're trying to read. And so there is, I'd say there's definitely an amount of burnout that you get on researching one specific topic, which is why you should pick a topic that you're very interested in.
To be honest, I never really experienced burnout mostly. And this was mostly because, around the time I did this paper, I actually finished my economics major, so there wasn't really that much pressure. And also, but I think what helped with me is that going in there, I was I only had a vague idea of what I wanted to do, which was I wanted to focus on a group of people a group of foreign people who lived in Shanghai. Because in fact, my one of the original ideas I had was to focus on the Japanese immigrants who lived in Shanghai, but basically what I just did is that I just looked through a bunch of information and see which one seemed more interesting or which one I could I could get like better results in trying to look at research for, and that's what pointed me into the direction of working on the British settlers.
So I'm actually not a history major. I'd say that you'll never get burned out if you're doing what you love. And I'm focused on this topic because I find the politics of Xinjiang very interesting, and it's a very specific, very niche topic. But I in both this and in my major classes, you will only get burned out if you're focused on something that you don't truly care about.